What's up guys, Justin here with the CGEssentials.com. So in today's video, we're going to talk about different ways that you can create stair railings in Blender. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. All right, so just a quick reminder before we get started, my course teaching you how to use Blender is going to be coming soon. That's going to contain very comprehensive instruction on how to start getting up and running, working in Blender. So if you do want a little bit of help learning how to use Blender, make sure you check out the course. You can get on the wait list by visiting the CGEssentials.com/course. All right, so there's a lot of tutorials floating around out there teaching you how to create different kinds of railings, but I'm not really finding any that do a great job of explaining kind of the whole process. So what I wanted to do is make a video talking about that. So a lot of what we're going to do is we're going to use the bevel function inside of curves. But most of the time what I recommend is you start with a mesh and then create a curve from that mesh. So in this situation, what I want to do is I just want to create a simple mesh, which is a rectangle, convert it to a curve, and then add a bevel. So we're going to go into a front-on view right here. I've got some things in the background which I don't want turned on. All right, so one of the things that I find extremely helpful is toggling on both the vertex snapping, but also for this kind of modeling, the edge center snapping. So you can click on this button to toggle vertex snapping on, but then you can do a click and then a shift click in order to select vertex and edge center. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow you to do a shift right click, and notice how this is going to snap to different points of this line. Well, in this case, I want to put it in the center of this edge right here. Well, then I'm going to go into front on mode. I'm going to do a shift A and I'm going to add a mesh. I'm going to add a plane and I'm going to align it to my view. Now you could also add like a single vertex or something like that, but for right now this is what we're going to do. And so what I want to do is I'm using Blender 4.0.1. I think this got added in Blender 4.0, but I can do a G, but then I can tap the B key on my keyboard in order to set a base point. And so when I set my base point, I'm going to click on this corner right here and I'm going to align this with this edge. And so what we're doing is we're using this mesh to create kind of guides for our railing. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to tab into edit mode. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete out these top two vertices. So make sure you're in vertex select mode, but tap X and delete those vertices. And then I'm just going to do a G, B to set this point, and I'm going to move this up to halfway in the middle of this step like this. Well, now what I have is I have an edge that's going to act as my top rail. And all I'm going to do is hit the A key and I'm going to do a G, Z to move it up, and we'll call it 36 inches right here. Well, then you can just select these two vertices, do an EZ, which is going to extrude this down, and we're going to extrude this until this hits the center of that stair. And you can go ahead and go into edge select mode, so hit 2 in edit mode, hit X on your keyboard, and we're going to delete out these edges. And I'm going to go ahead and toggle on my screencast keys so you can see that over here. But now what I've got is I've got a mesh right here that I want to add a bevel along so that I can have like a pipe railing. And what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to do a shift D and I'm going to duplicate this just because I want to show you something in a second. But for now, let's just take this object. Now we've got it selected. Remember that it's a mesh right here, but we want to go to Object, Convert, and we want to convert this to a curve. Well, notice how this is now a curve object. Well, if you remember with curves, so this actually gives you the ability under bevel in order to add a curve like this. Now we have a bit of a problem, and the problem is this doesn't go around this curve very well, right? It kind of like pinches it on the corner. That's just something that is basically in the Blender curve section. It's been a problem for a while. They still have not really fixed it, which is a little bit frustrating, but it is what it is. So what we want to do instead is I'm going to move this back over. So if we were to take this mesh before we converted it to a curve, right? So this is the copy I made, and tab in here into edit mode and select these two edges. What I want to do is I want to do a Control B to bevel it. Make sure you tap the V key so that it'll allow you to bevel vertices. But notice how I can use this to bevel this off so that I've got a smooth curve in here like this. Well, now if I take this whole thing, go to Object, Convert to Curve, and now I add my bevel like this, notice how I get a much smoother corner right here without all of that pinching. So you can use this in order to create a singular rail like this. Now we want to do the same thing over here, but now we want to add some intermediates. So I'm going to do a Shift A, I'm going to add a plane, and I'm just going to do this really quickly now. So I'm just doing the same thing where I'm aligning the vertices the same way that I was before. All right, and so what I want to do is I want to add some horizontal lines in here, or some horizontal pipes. And so what I want to do is I want to do a Control R to add a loop cut. I'm going to scroll my mouse up like this so that I've got two edges in here. Okay, and again, I'm going to take this whole thing and I'm going to make a copy of it because I want to show you something else. Now, what you could do is what we've done up to this point, right? You can come in here, you can tab in edit mode, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete out this edge and these faces. So I'm just going to select them, do an X, and delete only faces. That's going to leave me these edges. And then I can take this whole thing and I can convert it to a curve like this. And I can do the same thing with the bevel, right? And whoops, that's my geometry. I want to use the bevel option right here. Now the problem with this is when you do this way, it starts to get funky around the corner, or the vertices of the curve, right? So if I tab in edit mode, you can see this is a curve, but it's kind of like going in weird lines and other things like that. It just doesn't necessarily give us the result that we want. So one step that I would take before you do this, I'm going to move this one back over here. This is my mesh copy. So when you create these horizontals, what I would recommend is tabbing into edit mode and getting rid of this edge, only these faces. But then I would take these two edges right here and I would do an F3 and I would look for separate by selection. So you can just type in separate and look for by selection. And I recommend separating those into their own mesh before you do this curve conversion. And the other thing you probably want to do is you do want to come in here and you want to bevel these corners so you get this nice curve here. But now I've basically got two meshes in here, and so I'm just going to take them both and I'm going to convert them to curves. So I'll take both of them and convert them to curves, and then I'll add that bevel in here. So in this case, we're just going to add whatever we want this to be. We'll say it's maybe 1/2 inch right here. Then we'll add the same bevel to these. And notice how now I've got that rail in here. The other nice thing about doing it this way, and I've got my wireframe turned on just so you can kind of see this geometry. The nice thing about this is if you get a little bit of overlap on these ends right here, because this is a separate object, you can just make this like slightly smaller so that it's not bigger than your verticals here, so that this is a little bit more smooth. And then once you're done with that, you could take them both and then just do a Shift D to duplicate them like this and place them wherever you want. And so now you've got these nice pipe railings in here like this. And so now let's say that we wanted to add a railing to a stair. The process is very similar if you're creating those simple pipe railings. So like for example, what we might do in this situation is the same thing. So Shift right click to place this, Shift A to add a mesh. And actually if you toggle on the extra shapes add-on, so if you go into your add-ons and you toggle on extra objects, so add mesh extra objects, there's actually a tool in here where you can go into your mesh and you can add a single vertex. So I can place a vertex right here, tab into edit mode and select that vertex. Note that it'll only show up if you are in vertex edit mode, obviously, but I can just take that and I can just extrude it this way instead of having to create a plane and all of that. But I'll do a G, Z, bring this up 36 inches, extrude this down like this. Now, one thing we didn't really talk about that we definitely probably should is creating a rail with vertical pickets. So in this case, again, I'm just going to do a Control R and I'm going to do a loop subdivide. And when I do a loop subdivide, notice how I can scroll up and down and find the number of verticals that I want in here. You want to make sure that this is an even number of stairs in here if you're going to use this method. Just because if it's not an even number of stairs, then your loop cuts aren't going to be aligned in here. But in this situation, I think we're probably good. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to come take these verticals right here. And I'm going to do an F3. And I'm going to separate them by selection. So just search for separate by selection. So now all of those edges are going to be in here like this. And then this object is going to be in here just as like a regular object like this. But what I want to do is I want to do the same thing where I tab into edit mode. And in this case, you can go ahead and you can get rid of all of this. So you can just select it all, do an X, delete your edges. That's going to give you this rail right here like this. And then you can come in here and you can do that same thing where you're going to bevel those edges. So I'm going to delete out this edge right here. I'm going to do a Control B, tap the V key to go into vertex bevel mode. But now again, I've got the same thing, right? Where over here we had the horizontals, here we have the verticals, but then we're just going to convert them to a curve. We'll convert these to a curve, and then we'll add a bevel like this. And so then you could just take both of these, you could move them over a little bit, and then you could do a Shift D and duplicate them as well. And you could use snapping in here to be more precise with the placement, but that's how I would that's how you can create a railing that's got multiple different verticals in here. So now let's talk a little bit about how you can create a wall railing. So what I want to do in this situation is I want to create a railing that's actually going to run along the wall. And so what I want to do in this situation is I want to do the same thing, but without creating any kind of verticals. So I would just do a Shift right click. I'm going to do a Shift A and I'm going to add a single vertex. And so I'm going to take this vertex and I want to extrude this. And basically what I'm doing in this situation is I'm actually using the stair as a guide. So notice what I'm doing is I am basically extruding an edge like this all around the outside corner, right? So now if I do a G, Z, and I move that up, I've got my kind of like wall rail profile, and I can put it to whatever height I want it to be. I could take it, I could convert it to a curve, and we're gonna add a bevel. So like a 1/2 inch bevel right here. But then you would do the same thing on the other side. So I would do a Shift right click, I'm gonna do a Shift A, I'm gonna add a single vertex right here. Tab into edit mode. I'm gonna extrude, whoops. Make sure I'm in edit mode, I'm gonna extrude this up. And again, I'm just aligning it with these edges. So in this case, I'm using the front side of the stair. Luckily, it's less important when it's a wall rail because you can't really see if you're slightly off. But then I'm going to do a G, Z, and I'm going to move it up 36 inches. And then again, I can just take this rail and I can convert it to a curve and I can bevel it. All right, so one thing I didn't talk about here that I probably should is when these turn like this, notice how you can get some kind of like harsh corners in here. They're not especially bad, but a lot of the time those are rounded. Well, again, you can toggle in here, and you want to do this before you convert this to a mesh. So I'm just gonna, or before you convert this to a curve, so I'm just gonna convert it back to a mesh for a second. But if I tab into edit mode, do a Control B, and go into vertex select mode, or vertex bevel mode, so Control B, V, like this, what you can do is you can use the bevel tool in order to bevel these off so that they're smoother, right? So you don't get those kind of like harsh turns in here. And then from there, you can do the same thing, right? You convert it to a curve and you just add your bevel, so 0.5 right here. But notice what that does is that gives you this nicer turning edge around the corners in here. All right, and so say you had a stair like this one and you wanted to add some verticals, kind of like we did before. So all you would have to do in this case is just kind of follow that same process. It gets a little bit more complex because you're turning a corner, but it's not really that bad, right? Because what you're gonna do is you're going to do a Shift A, you're gonna add a single vertex right here. I'm gonna tab into edit mode so that I have that vertex selected. But again, we're gonna extrude this up right here. We're going to extrude it over. We'll extrude it until it's halfway to this point. Extrude it over here. And we'll extrude it over here, right? And then we can tap that A key and we can do an E, Z to extrude up. I'm going to type in a value of 36 inches again, like this. But notice how we're using this mesh in order to get those locations or to get those vertical locations. Well, now if I do a Control R like this, notice I can add loop cuts in here, and I could add a vertical in every one of these stairs. I could add it to every other stair like this. The spacing is basically set by your stairs, but in this case I can just add in all of these different loop cuts like this. All right, and then at this point it's kind of that same process. So I'll speed this up. And so that'll give you a nice railing that turns the corner right here. All right, so then another really easy way to create a railing is if you have like a steel stringer. So the way that might work is you might add a plane. I'm going to do an R X 90, and then we'll just do a GB to set a base point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to align this with the bottom of my stair here, like this. And then I can just take both of these and do a GB. And then I can take these and I can extrude them like this. And I'm going to tap B to set a base point again. And we're just going to extrude this all the way around the outside like this. Well, then we can take that whole thing and we can hit the A key, and I'm just going to do an F3, and I'm going to look for solidify faces right here. And so when I do a solidify faces, what that's going to do is that's going to allow me to create a stringer like this. So say we wanted it to be 4 inches, we could give it a thickness of 4 inches. Well, the cool thing about that is if you create a railing that's on a stringer like this, you don't have to worry nearly as much about the spacing of the steps, right? So I can tab in here, I can do a Control R in order to add a loop cut. Then I'm just going to right click in order to leave that. But notice how that gives me a path right along the middle here that you can create that stair along. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this, I'm going to do a Shift D to duplicate it, and then I'm going to do an F3, and I'm going to search for separate by selection. So you can just look for separate by selection. That's going to make this rail its own object in here, and now you can work with this. So you could do really whatever you wanted to with this. So for example, I can move this back down, then tab into edit mode and extrude it up like this in a Z direction. So you could use this to add things like a glass rail. All right, and then from here, it would be nice to be able to come in here and just kind of extrude something along this path. That's a tool I wish Blender would add, but you can do an E, Z, and extrude this up to give it some thickness. So say you wanted a little bit of a rail, right? So maybe something that's like 1 inch right here. Well, then you could take these faces and you could use a tool like the extrude along normals function in order to give this thickness in 2 directions, just like this. But that would give you a rail with kind of a metal top. And you might have to come in here and kind of like fill this in a little bit. So if anyone knows an easier way to do that, let me know. All right, and then last, let's talk about a way that we might be able to add a rail to this spiral stair. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to do a Shift A, and I just want to add some sort of a vertical post. So in this case, we could say that it was going to be rectangular, or we could also do cylindrical. So we'll do cylindrical right here, and I'm just going to scale this down like this. Scale it on the Z axis, and we'll just kind of align it with where we want on this surface. And we want to go ahead and we want to make sure that we've applied our rotation and scale, and then I can just tab in here and I can just use the inset function and just create like a simple rail, right? So something like this, nothing special. And then I might do an ES to do this outward scale and extrude this up just like this. Well, now what I want to do is I want to repeat this along all of these different edges, right? And so to do that, what I want to do is I want to use this same array modifier. So what I can do is I can select this object, then do a shift click to select this stair, and I can click on the drop down for my array and click on copy to select it. Now notice how at the moment this isn't working properly. That's because this is offsetting this based on an empty location, which is in the middle of my model, right? You can watch the last video where I showed you how to create the spiral stair in order to do that. But basically, this is being arrayed based on the origin of this object right here. So what I want to do is I just want to change this object's origin so that it's the same as this one. So in order to do that, I'm going to select my spiral stair. I'm going to do a Shift S in order to put my cursor to active. Right here, notice how that puts my 3D cursor on this object's origin. Well, then I can take this object and I can do an object set origin to 3D cursor. Well, notice how now my 3D cursor is in the same direction, and what that means is that this is now being repeated with that same array. Well, then I can come in here, and depending on what you want to do, so this is all going to depend on the kind of rail that you want to create. In this case, for example, though, let's say that we just wanted to create a rail, and I'm going to pick a couple of the faces that are in here, and I'm just going to extrude this out like this. So we're just going to go into a top-down view, and we're just going to kind of manually move this so that it aligns with this object right here. And I mean, obviously it's not perfect, but when we do that, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to move that up as well. So we'll do a GZ in order to move this. But notice what that's going to do is that's going to give us this railing that kind of continues around the top here. And you know, you could do some different things with this. Obviously make this a little bit better if you wanted to. So I might move it down like this. And I don't necessarily care if it's like ultra perfect in that location, but this is basically the principle you can use in order to create this spiral stair rail in Blender. All right, so that's where I'm gonna end this video. Leave a comment below. Let me know if you have a way of creating railings we didn't talk about in this video. I just love having that conversation with you guys. If you do want to get some additional help learning Blender, my course is going to launch very soon. You can get on the wait list by visiting the cgessentials.com/course. But as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.